Okay, so Borada, good morning, everybody. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. My name's Jay Shepherd. I'm one of the project managers at Marine Energy Wales and helping organise this series of events as part of the Selkie Project. The Selkie Project is organising this series focused on providing business support for companies looking to diversify into the marine energy sector. These events will give your company the opportunity to learn more about key themes from the experts in the sector and to help in your endeavours to enter and work in this innovative and growing industry. It will also give you the opportunity to network and meet other companies. So today's session, we're going to be focusing on health and safety, and we're delighted to be joined by our expert today, Ian Ord of Watson Ord Renewables. So Watson Ord Renewables are a specialist health and safety consultancy for the renewable energy sector. After gaining over 20 years of experience in the wind industry, Ian Ord of Watson Ord Renewables has an in-depth understanding of the industry needs and is able to provide invaluable safety support to the growing offshore renewable industries. In partnership with Setters under the banner of Renewables at Setters, the two companies provide a balanced approach to safety improvement and training with a key ethos of safety equals systems plus people. So this session will cover key topics in health and safety requirements for offshore renewables deployments and include case studies of Ian's work in the marine energy sector. So a few housekeeping notes before I hand you over to Ian. So if all participants could please remain on mute unless indicated, this stops any feedback and ensures that everybody can hear our speaker clearly. If you could all put your company name in your Zoom name, if you can right click on your video feed, put your company name in there, we then know where everybody is joining us from. We will have a Q&A feature. You're more than welcome to put any questions into the Q&A in the chat as we're going through the session. I had a chat with Ian beforehand. He's happy to take questions as we go through the presentation as well. There'll be time for questions at the end as well. So yeah, if you want to come in with a question locally to speak it, just use the raise your hand feature, and either myself or my colleague Sophie will indicate to you when we can take the question. And then, yeah, if you need any assistance at any point, if you have any technical difficulties, please just drop that in the chat. And feel free to follow us on social media at the Selkie Project, or use the hashtag Meet the Expert on social media. And this session will also be recorded, just so you're aware, and will be reposted to be viewed again in the coming days. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to today's expert, Ian Ord.
Good morning, everybody. I hope everybody is safe and well and keeping safe away from this COVID. I had my first 2 days face-to-face training, yes, kind of Monday, Tuesday and Wednesday. So it was my first steps out into the big bad world, and it wasn't too bad. So, but there we go. A little bit about myself. I worked 17 years in the coal industry. So in dirty energy, as the coal mines were closing, I somehow fell into health and safety. I met a guy called Graham Setter. He said, come and join me. I did my certificate, my diploma in health and safety. And one of the first customers that I worked for was Bonus Wind Turbines down in Newtown, Mid Wales. And at that stage, wind energy was kind of fairly new. It was a small scale industry, almost a cottage industry. It was immense fun working in that industry, meeting colleagues in Denmark on a regular basis. And I think one of the things that struck me was the reason they needed our help was they didn't have a safety management system. And that was 1998. So it was a long time ago, but there was still a requirement for risk assessment, safety management systems, procedures, and things like that. So I helped them implement the first safety management system in wind. I see remnants of that of other organizations that I'm now helping with. And I certainly can see my name sometimes on documents that were produced kind of early 2000s and maybe into the 90s. So one of the things, because it was a new industry, it was kind of unknown risks. And, you know, that what was the American politician said, the unknown unknowns. You got known unknowns and unknown unknowns. I think any new industry has those unknown unknowns, and that's the importance of risk assessment. So that's me, 20 odd years in wind, but through that period of time I've worked on solar. Now I'm supporting the Moleye's project, but when I left Siemens, I worked for Siemens as well, Siemens Wind Power. I went to Strandford Lock and did an audit on the tidal turbine there. And now looking at tidal energy, it's a wonderful thing that we're doing. It's kind of renewable energy is the way forward, but we have challenges because it's new. Anything working in the sea is going to be 10 times more difficult than working on land. So I think what I kind of want to go through today is not necessarily risk assessment, and it's certainly, please don't think I'm going to try to teach granny to suck eggs. It's not about that. It's actually looking a little bit more about the wider risk assessment processes that we need to consider. Obviously, risk assessment is about identifying hazards, and then so we control those hazards or control the risk of harm. Because that harm can be many things. Harm can be an injury to an individual or ill health. It could also be damage to property. And when you've got new prototype pieces of kit, the last thing you want to do is get them damaged. But it can also damage reputation, damage the reputation of a project, of a company, or of individuals. So it's wrong to think that we just should focus on keeping people safe. That is a vital and must be the priority. But we can take the opportunity to look at the other things. Risk assessment and the various forms of assessing risk is the starting point to achieving an understanding of how we put a safe system of work together. Safe system of work is required by Health and Safety at Work Act, so it's an important starting point. And one of the things certainly I've learned over the years is paperwork, the risk assessments, the method statements are just the starting point. If you've put the effort in, or individuals have put the effort in to create a document, you must then use it correctly. You're stating what you're going to do as an organisation. So therefore, it needs to be checked and monitored that people are using those procedures. So, a little bit of granny sucking eggs here. Risk assessment is about eliminating or reducing the occurrences of unplanned events, which could result in loss or injury. Having done a risk assessment, we obviously try to eliminate any risk if we can, but then we'll look at reducing the severity of any loss or injury. We should also risk assess when there is change, whether that's positive or negative. So if improvements are making to a task, a workflow, or a product, or a machine, or people, then we should still reassess. So if we're making something safer, we should record that it's being made safer. And also risk assessment actually is not just about looking at the job. It's actually about the whole of the life cycle of a project, right from design, and actually maybe even at concept, you should be considering the assessment of risk in its various forms. And that life cycle should go all the way through to understanding how it can be demolished and removed. All of those things are required by standards and legislation. Project risk management is linked to three things, and it's risk, compliance, and the planning. And the risk is we look at design risk assessments, hazards and HAZOPs. I'll come to that a little bit later on. Normal work-based risk assessment, getting down to specific task-specific risk assessments, like manual handling, control of hazardous energy assessments, COSH assessments. And it builds up a risk register for a project. Your list of risk assessments are transferred to a register, so you see a clear kind of list of risks that apply to a certain project. And we do risk assessments, one, because we are trying to prevent harm, but we also have to do risk assessments because of legislation and therefore to comply with the management regs, the electricity at work regulations, etc., etc. Often it will be a contractual obligation that risk assessments are carried out. There is also should be a project legal register, and if there's a legal register, it comes back to the Health and Safety at Work Act that you've got to do risk assessments. A lot of organizations, if they are the developers or the designers or the builders of products, will also need to fit in with the client's occupational health and safety environment strategy for a project. CDM requires risk assessments to be carried out, construction design and management regulations, and also ISO 45001, which is the new standard for safety management systems. So there's the compliance element. After all of that, we have to plan the work that we do. We know that there will be a project work plan for the installation against time and kind of resources to get a tidal turbine into the sea and working. There will be a project occupational health and safety and environment plan. There'll be a construction design management pre-construction information that needs to be provided to contractors and developers. And all of this and the action that we need to take will need to be agreed and confirmed, and the responsibilities to roll out those plans. And then under CDM, there needs to be construction health and safety plans. So a lot of information, a lot of documents are created by the requirements of health and safety. And it's all about getting down on paper how we're going to manage this risk. You know what a hazard is, you know what a risk is, but often we forget about, we need to look when we're looking at risk about probability, about risk events and how harm would occur. It's often very easy to say, well, somebody's working 50 meters up in the air, so that's working at height. So therefore, there's a risk of a fall. If you fall that distance, you're going to die, so it's a high risk. However, if working up 50 meters, the height is protected by barriers and things like that, the actual harm is going to be difficult to become real. The protection has been designed in. So actually, we've got to look at how a risk event may happen. We've also got to kind of differentiate risk with the severity of any harm. The risk averseness that certainly we see with COVID over the last 16 to 18 months is that some people don't care about the risk and other people are absolutely terrified about the risk. They are risk averse. They don't want to take any risk whatsoever. Has to be a balanced approach. And you can look at that by looking at the severity. If somebody's going to cut their finger, we don't need to put a high number of control measures in place. If anything's going to be harmed, broken, the higher kind of severities, we've got to put the control measures in place. And that's the benefit of doing risk assessment. It allows us to prioritize risk and therefore prioritize the investment and the work and the competence and training that we need to put in to minimize risk. This is just a quick slide to just kind of to show that what we need to understand the mechanisms of an injury. So when we look at how an accident may happen, we've got to think about, well, how would it happen? And just a simple, silly little kind of graphic up on the top right-hand corner. And it's using a shredding machine. But how could somebody be injured using a shredding machine? There will be a minimum gap and you wouldn't be able to put your fingers in there. There's a design standard for that. However, a scarf could go in there. And what this picture kind of indicates is there's a guard at the bottom to keep people away from the shredding machine. However, if you take people further away, so the guard is extended, what it's showing is the lady there has to bend over more, that then brings into play her scarf going into the shredding machine. We have to consider all of those things. The likelihood of injury, the graphic in the bottom left-hand corner, is the first kind of seating position. There are less likelihood of any injury than somebody sitting on the right-hand side of the sitting position. And then severity can be from a cut finger to a catastrophic explosion. All of those things have got to be considered when we carry out risk assessments. There are a lot of different techniques that can be used. Delphi, mind mapping, diagrams, what ifs. We need, when we're getting to the higher level, higher complex kind of tasks, we've got to get experts in. The experts don't have to be outside experts. They'll be experts within your own organization. Talk to people, consult with people to find out more. Carry out SWOT analysis, risk categories, all of these type of processes and structuring tools that are out there. And look at previous events. Has this work been carried out before? Is there a history of certain events on a certain project? So revisit lessons learned, look at previous project documentation. And out of all of that risk identification will come your risk registers, aspects and impacts registers for environmental, your risk assessments, and your safe systems of work. With all that, I want to really start at the beginning and the importance of design risk assessment. It's something that I've learned are vitally important. At the start of a project, you've got to get contractors, developers, designers, clients together to talk about the design of a product. And design risk assessments are the opportunity by architects for buildings, but mechanical, electrical kind of engineers in the design stage to think about not only how a product or a piece of machinery is going to be built, but how it's going to be used, how it's going to be installed, how it's going to be maintained, and how it's going to be demolished at the end of its life safely, without risk to people, without risk to the environment. Simple things about like making certain that points of isolation can be easily accessible. So electricians are not having to go inside an electrical cabinet, which may be 690 volts, to throw a switch or to pull a fuse. It'd be much better if, by design, there is an isolation switch outside the cabinet. And this designer risk assessment determines the potential risk right through the design process. It should be evidenced. There should be design risk assessments. There should be decision-making registers amongst the whole process. So when things possibly go wrong at design stage, they can go back, make the changes and change those details. So it's important that certainly principal designers of a project or clients challenge the designers at an early stage to get an understanding. Everybody has a role in a project to think about safety in design. Safety in design is not only a product, it can be a workflow and how work is carried out. So that is design as well. So design is a product, but design is how you're going to do the work. So at a design stage, early stage, kind of designers and principal designers have got to think about how the work of maintaining that product can be carried out. So if we take a tidal turbine, how are we going to get to that tidal turbine? How are we going to get on the turbine from a transfer vessel? How do we stay safe within that tidal turbine? How do we get tools there? All of those things. What do we do in an emergency? What do we do in bad weather? So a lot of what ifs and what ifs kind of will take part when we're doing in design risk assessment workshops. We need to plan, have a sensible plan for how work is going to be carried out. We need to consult with the people, the engineers, the technicians who are going to work on this product. We need to cooperate and coordinate with all the kind of stakeholders in the project. Have the right documentation up to date. There's a legal requirement to have up to date plans and electrical diagrams. And we need to communicate this information effectively so everybody knows. Within a project, there'll be a number of players, contractors, subcontractors, and they all need to be on the same information kind of line. They must know the same information. Communications is vital in any safe project. The legal framework for safety and design, the codes and standards, and they almost need to be adhered to. We are slightly hitting a small problem in the UK at the moment because of Brexit, because however the government said there was going to be no change to health and safety legislation, lo and behold, there is kind of changes being made. Not necessarily about the content, it's often about putting UK and a different title for a European standard, but just watch out for that. But we must consider that we must meet the standards of the location and of the country that we're doing the work in. So again, that's the links to the legal register for a project. So just something to be minded about. So always check the standards and verify them that you've got everything in place. It's another element of a risk assessment that the design risk assessment has considered the relevant standards. We should carry out hazard identification studies, and I think this is a great starting point. If you've missed, and often it's the case that the opportunity to do design risk assessments or to challenge them and talk about them has been missed, it's a good idea to have a hazard identification study workshop just before or in good time before the project starts, to just get everybody focused on understanding the hazards throughout the project. And really it's looking at all the kind of hazards that may be carried out during the build of the project, and then you pass that hazard on to the maintenance section of the product, of the project, and let them know these were the hazards we faced. Take that and kind of develop your own hazard. Again, looks at loss of property, obviously injury to people, damage to the environment, production, or it may become a liability. So that is hazard. A hazard, HAZOP, tends to be the next stage, and how are we going to operate this product? We've had a design risk assessment, we've done hazard identification on how it's going to be built and commissioned, and now we're looking at the operational side of it. So we're looking at a structured and systematic examination of all the different complex processes of getting people to work, getting people away from work, carrying out certain maintenance, daily maintenance, doing retrofits, doing kind of annual maintenance, the links to high voltage maintenance as well, right through to the substation. So we spread that out. So that tends to be a hazard operability study. And then HERA is basically our basic hazard identification and risk assessment, but actually going into a great deal of depth. So those risks or those tasks that we've identified as being a high risk, we should then go back to them and do this in-depth assessment of all those elements I've been talking about. How an accident could happen, who needs to be involved. We need to look at records, frequency assessments, looking at existing controls and recommend how those controls can be improved. So this is very in-depth, very specialist, getting engineers, getting managers involved and having another look at those high-risk kind of elements that we've identified in HAZOPs and hazards. And out of all of that, we have a number of control measures. And this is the magic of risk assessments. Having identified that we've got the most dangerous project that could ever be designed, we now start, by putting control measures in place, start to see that actually this project can be run very safely. And it's making certain that the design standards are maintained, that guards are in place and can't be removed, that the points of isolation, the example I gave, are easy to access and safe to use, that there are sufficient emergency stops in the right places so people can use them whenever they need to, that we can get to and from a place of work safely and without risk, there is protection against falls, and we can go on and on and on about those things. But the important thing is that we check, and not just check once to see that they've been done, but actually continue to check. And certainly with design, we'll be looking at through the hazard, through certification, through scheduled examinations, and that is the forward looking. Those certification and scheduled examinations will usually happen on an annual basis, and it checks the security and design standards are being maintained. So those are the control measures in design. When we look at the systems, it's ensuring that we have the safe working procedures for maintenance activities, safety rules in place, method statements and work instructions and service manuals that are up to date. We start inspecting, doing fire and safety inspections, access inspections, understanding that what training that needs to be provided and how competence can be developed. So we have the compliance with the highest needs of competence. Change management is one of the trickiest things. It's too easy to make a change. It's more difficult to then check all the things you need to do with that change. As I say, a change should trigger an additional risk assessment. Even if the change is for the better, you've still got to reassess the task. And we mustn't forget that along all of this, we must have emergency response. If it's working at height, if somebody's dangling from a harness, you need to have an emergency plan to get them away. So emergency response is another element that comes out of risk assessment. And again, the checking of systems is inspections and audits, and making certain that our safe working procedures actually are being used in reality, not just that they're there and they're nice and clean and they're in a folder and they're up to date. We need to check that the safe working procedures are being implemented at the point of work. It's interesting to see now with the health and safety executive, if they visit a site for any reason, they're not necessarily going to have a great deal of interest in your safe working procedures, but they will want to know that the people at the front end doing the work understand the risk assessments, have seen them, and are following the standards. And likewise, with 45,001 now, they will be asking about how leadership is being carried out on a project, how often the workforce see the leaders, how the leaders communicate and consult with them. So it's another element to consider. And people. And remember, I said about safety equals systems plus people. You could have the best systems in the world. You could have done the best design risk assessments in the world. But in the end, if the people who are involved in the project choose to do something different that has kind of from what has been designed, that's going to increase the risk of an accident. So we need to select the right people who have had the right training and kind of have the correct level of competence. And competence could be more than just their technical understanding and knowledge. It can be their behavior, it can be their leadership qualities or lack of. So getting those first three is right. We have to encourage the safest behaviors of the team on the project that we possibly can. And the only way to do that is to talk to people, encourage people. So the attitudes are positive, and that we get to a position where we have a generative approach to health and safety. That why would we do something unsafely? There is no benefit. So our belief and our attitudes are all about working safely all the time, and that we should encourage people to actually challenge whenever there's a dip in standards. And that really is built up by having this motivation to work safely. Checking people is really difficult, because if I said to you now, I'm going to check what you're doing, the first thing you think about is the negative side of it. What right does that individual have to come and check me? So it has to be done in a correct possible way. We have safety conversations with people. We actually carry out inductions and include people. We consult with people. We ask about their views of the risk assessment and the work that's being done. In many ways, at the start of a project, the engineers, the technicians, the scientists are the experts of what's going on. When we start to work on the project, the technicians, the workforce, they become the experts on what's happening on a day-to-day basis. So we need to involve them. We need to consult with them right at the sharp end and give them the support so they can work safely. So consultation and communication again becomes vital, as does leadership. And if the leaders of an organization are doing the right thing for health and safety, who are carrying out conversations, safety conversations with the whole workforce, those levels of leadership further down the organization will follow and carry out those tasks as well. There's lots and lots to do with risk assessment, but we must monitor and review to make certain if we reach a high standard, we maintain a high standard. So risk is, when I spoke about inspections, there tends to be a checklist mentality. I need to do a safety inspection. I'm going to take the normal checklist that I take every time I do a safety inspection, and off I go. And lo and behold, every time I take this same checklist, I tick the same boxes, because I'm almost gonna get what I always get. However, we need to look at inspections by looking at the risk assessments, look at the method statements, add things to that kind of checklist that we need to look at, change the content of those inspections, and start looking at the actual work and that it meets the standard that has been set on the project. That is proper inspections. That is proper monitoring. So take away the standard checklists and actually be adaptable on what you're going to inspect and monitor. You should always do in-depth inspections and monitoring after an incident. However small, any incident is kind of an element of failure, and it could be a sign of other things to come. So nipping things in the bud, inspect, monitor, and if things are identified, improve straight away and communicate, consult with those improvements. Whenever change occurs, again, carry out this inspection or this kind of range of monitoring so you understand that the change has not caused any kind of negative effect. Just that example of the lady with the scarf, by making that guard further away from the machine meant that she's going to lean forward and the scarf goes forward. Positive change, yes, but actually has a negative effect. And then periodically carry out your standard inspections that kind of almost check that we're meeting our legislative compliance requirements. And how we do that is safety conversations and consultation with all stakeholders. So, summing up, risk assessments are better than accident investigations. And in a perverse way, when you carry out an accident investigation, you actually are retrospectively carrying out a risk assessment. Trouble is, you actually know what the consequences are. I've been involved in a few accident investigations, and an ultimate accident investigation, and it's not nice. It really isn't. I much prefer to do this boring kind of, as it's seen out there, health and safety stuff, carrying out risk assessments. We've got to risk assess everything. Yeah, why not? Because it's better than the alternative, believe me. So it's proactive, it's positive, it gets us an understanding of what's out there. If we identify low-level risks, remember, the law doesn't actually require us to do anything. We have to actually deal with relevant kind of risks, not minor risks. So carried out to identify hazards, determine risk, and introduce control measures to allow this safe system of work and to avoid accident. Fundamentally, that's what health and safety is all about. So it's better to do the mundane, but actually if you do risk assessments correctly, if you get involved in the technical side of it, if you talk and consult with people, actually you learn an awful lot about the project as well. So I think that is me. So thank you for your time. I'm passionate about these things. I really do think risk assessment, health and safety is important. So there we go. Jay, take it away.
Thank you very much for that presentation there, Ian. We've had one question come in through the chat. Kevin Lean, I'd like to invite you to come up and ask your question personally. It's quite nice to see people on the cameras and actually hear the question in person, just so that we can make sure that we've got the right end of it.
Sure, no problem. Morning,
Hi,
Ian.
Kevin.
Morning, Jay. How are you?
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ian. Just on the project legal register under compliance, it's not something that I'm very familiar with. So if you could expand a little on that and what the requirements are for a project, just at a high level, maybe would be very helpful.
Yeah, and I think often the kind of the type of work that is going to be carried out on a project will indicate that you're going to have to comply with certain legislation. So if you're working with electricity, it is your local kind of electricity kind of legislation. So in the UK, it would be electricity at work regulations across an island. I think you've got a wider electrical health and safety standard, which has lots of subjects in it, if I remember rightly, but it's being able to refer to those. So then, you know, on a tidal project, when you start to think of the things that we're going to have to do, you start to get into, obviously working with electricity, there'll be construction legislation we have to comply with. Then you get into maritime legislation that we're going to have to comply with. And I think it's a good thing to start to list those. Then when you do your risk assessments, more things come up. And what I like to do is to have a risk register and a legal register of all the legislation that may be relevant, and actually all the standards that we may have to comply with, and then you cross-reference them. So kind of, I've got a ready-made list of hundreds of pieces of legislation, and through the risk assessments, kind of, if we're working with electricity, I can cross-reference that with an electrical standard, EN 50110, for example, but also if it's in the UK electricity at work regulation. So I've got a ready-made list. Happy to share that with anybody if you want to drop me a line. And it's just a starting point. And then, because with the ultimate, Kevin, if something does go wrong, the inspectors are going to say, have you complied with kind of this piece of legislation? Well,
Right.
actually, yeah, we've got it on our legal register, and this is what we've done. It's linked to this risk assessment, and all of a sudden they will feel better about it. So that's all a legal register is. Really helps. So
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, and yeah, probably not something I'd thought of before. So thanks very much.
no problem.
We've got another question come in from TJ or Tim. Would you like to come on and ask your question, Tim?
I don't know, my camera ready, Jay.
That's fine. We can listen to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Ian. That was a very interesting presentation. Health and safety is vital, as you were saying, from design to demolition. You mentioned that you put an SMS together back in the late 90s for a wind, the first offshore wind. But have you done many of those safety management systems for other projects?
Yeah, kind of. Obviously, there's a standard, and early days then it would have been HSG 65 in the UK. So there was a standard for a safety management system. 18001 comes along, and over the past number of years, you follow the requirements of the standard to put a safety management system together. Now it's 45001. But when you do that, you've got to consider the risks that are associated with the work that you do, the organizations involved in, or anything like that. So there's part of a safety management system, which is a legal compliance. So you've got to have your kind of health and safety policy statement. You've got to have competencies and all of these type of things. But also, you've got to have your operational safety management procedures as well. So that tags on to any safety management system. So there are parts of safety management systems that are always very similar, but then once you step into what you actually do, your safe work and procedures, which are connected to them, that's where the big difference kind of happens. That's where the important things, that's where the risk assessments happen, and out of the risk assessments come your safe system of work.
Okay, and have you, like, what's the furthest field that you have worked? Have you worked around Europe?
I've worked kind of Germany, Denmark, an awful lot across there. Sweden, that was interesting in Sweden, just because there's snow and the ice. That's kind of, it's not a hazard and risk that I'd associated with that much snow and ice. Strange enough, just a quick one there. With that one, that was an offshore wind farm, and they had 2 vessels, and it was only a small offshore site. And I said, "Why have you got 2 vessels? Surely only, you've only got." I think they had 10 technicians. We said that one is an icebreaker. So yeah, that wouldn't work with tidal turbines. But it's just, they've done their risk assessment. They needed to get out there. How do you get out there safely on a transfer vessel when there's ice that is kind of a foot thick? You use a. So yeah, I kind of haven't been to Australia, but certainly I've communicated with a few organisations in New Zealand and Australia. And recently we're supporting a couple of organisations, Ørsted, in the wind industry, who are kind of putting sites up in Taiwan. So again, it's coming up with different cultures and things like that. So we do a bit of training that. So yeah, and various things, solar and construction, general stuff, house building, but primarily, and kind of renewable energy is certainly my enthusiastic kind of subject that I like.
Could I just ask a follow-on question, sorry, for me on that? Just in your experience across Europe, and I know you mentioned earlier in your talk, very important to make sure that you comply with local legislation. But in the European context, is there overarching European legislation that that covers each country, or do you in the first instance ensure you can comply with local legislation and then maybe take international standards into account, or is it a hand in glove type situation? You do both in parallel?
Yeah, I think what I found is over the years, this legal register I was talking about, Kevin, I've got a legal register for Denmark, Germany, Sweden, France, Belgium.
Okay. Yeah.
And actually, there's not a lot of difference. So the legislation may have different names, but ultimately their prime piece of legislation says that you should you should work safely. You should have a way of working that is safe with different terminology. So there's not a lot of difference. Actually, taking what you've already got and then just checking that there are any specifics. There are specific. If you take Holland, especially, to work as an electrician in Holland, you're appointed by the government. So there are certain standards of electrical competence that you have to have, but you're appointed to that. So where we do City and Guilds and we get our kind of Michael know the different kind of levels of training in City and Guilds for being an electrician, actually in European countries, they have specifics, certainly about electricity. So it's being aware of those things, because that could suddenly be a project showstopper.
Yeah.
Because, in Spain, and kind of that's where you have to start looking. But in general, it's about safety, safe working procedures and things like that.
It's a lot of commonality. Yeah. Thanks a million.
No, so we've had just a quick one. Sorry, in Belgium, the King of Belgium must be an IOSH member, because in Belgium legislation it says the King says you should work safely. So I like that.
Funny little stat there. So we've got a couple more questions that have come in. I just want to make sure that everybody gets their questions addressed. So if we could have Mike Cole come on and ask his question, please. And then after Mike, we'll go to Gareth Ullman.
Thank you very much. How are you, Ian?
Good to see you. Mike. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Ian, I just wondered if you could mention the role of behavioural safety a bit and how that might apply to this sector.
Yeah, I think behavioural safety obviously has a major effect. Without people doing the right thing, any safety management system, any procedure, any quality system is going to fail. So people are really important. And I think what I found certainly in the wind industry, more so in offshore wind, is you've got to rely on people more. In a factory, you can have your people in the white coats as supervisors watching people all the time. You can't do that in the middle of the sea, up a big kind of 100-meter tower, or in a tidal turbine while they're doing the maintenance there. There has to be more a kind of responsibility and trust in those individuals. But you have to work on getting people's behaviors right. It has to be an inclusive thing. You have to start talking about consultation, conversations, communication right from the start of the project. Because if you do, people will come towards you and will listen to you. And therefore you start to affect behaviors. But again, it kind of, in many ways, when the behavior starts to become negative, you've got to be aware of it. And you've got to almost encourage people to share things with you. It's people, I think we all have an inbuilt thing that we don't like to split on people. However, if it's somebody's safety or a group of people's safety that is at risk, we need to have those conversations. So there's lots of techniques, but for me, it's encouraging people to work safely and letting them know the importance of them in getting it right. Lots of different techniques, as you know, Mike, that we can put in place, but fundamentals: communicate, consult, listen, involve, and usually you'll get the behaviors right.
Gareth, would you like to come forward with your question?
Thanks. Good morning. At Monesto, we design kites that generate electricity from the seabed using tidal energy. We have our kite design team, and then we have an infrastructure design team, and then they come together on site. So I noticed when you were discussing design risk management, you had the list of design, build, installation, use, and recovery. So at the moment, our risk management plan would be for each separately. So we'd split it as a kite would be risk management plan would include design, build, some installation, and how it's used. And then our infrastructure design risk management plan would include installation, some use, and how it's recovered. Yeah. What's your opinion on others? Is it okay to do it like that, or should I have an overriding document which brings both together?
I think kind of it's the right way to go, because you have to have a focus at design, without a doubt, and it kind of, you got the expertise and things like that. But at some stage, whatever the design is going to have to interact with other things. And at that stage, when I was talking about hazards and HAZOPs, that brings the whole thing in. So if the kite kind of device that you've got came into a project, we're now going to think, okay, that is the main part, that is kind of new, that is something we need to risk assess. However, that's got to be linked to the high voltage cables, linked to the substation. In some projects, there are going to be other devices close by. So therefore, everything has to come in under one hazard identification, because the problem could be that the interaction with the kite device with something else, that's where the problem lies. So I think it's good to focus initially, but also then start to merge things with other devices, other processes, and things like that. What often happens then, Gareth, is you pick up that there's a little bit of a gap between, and the only time that you actually see that gap is when you look at the two sides of it. So, but you're doing the right thing, but then it's just at some stage it is to have a session, have a workshop when you bring the two closer together.
Yeah.
Because certainly that's what we'll do in a project.
Yeah, it's what we also have is two different cultures. Our design team is predominantly Sweden, and our infrastructure team is predominantly UK. So the challenge that we sometimes get from a HSE perspective is getting both cultures to appreciate each other. And just then, one quick question. I was just out of being nosy. Which device were you working on in Strangford Lough?
It was the, I thought there was only the, I can't remember now. It was the one where the two.
Is it the Maygen one?
Yes.
Ah, cool.
So it was quite astonishing. Having come from wind, and climbing a turbine is you've got your harness, you're doing everything correctly, you hook on right from the start. To go out in a rib and to kind of, whoa, this is interesting. It's quite exciting. Just a quick one on, you mentioned cultures with different countries. What I found, and this is through experience of almost being marched out to countries, is we have a tendency in the UK to think we're the best about health and safety. And we bang on about, you got to comply with the Health and Safety at Work Act. We talk about UK legislation. And what I found is, if you take away that and you talk about, let's talk about electrical safety, there's no argument. You know, if somebody is not interested in electrical safety, well, you've got a problem. But with any country, any engineers, any technicians, if you talk about safety collectively, that's not a problem. As soon as you start mentioning Health and Safety at Work Act, oh, there they are, they're off again, and they think they're more superior than we are. I believe that throughout Europe, actually health and safety is fairly standard. Certainly the different legislations are so close. I don't see different countries being more dangerous or reckless than other countries. The only difference in the UK is our legislation allows senior directors to go to prison, whereas European legislation almost demands that the organisations, if somebody gets harmed, that they look after them. That's the only difference. So I think, again, it's how we consult, how we communicate with each other, because I've made those mistakes. I really have. It's kind of, and it's not comfortable, you know, but there we go. Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Any final questions from anybody before we draw the session to a close? Now's your chance. No, silence. Well, thank you very much for participating today, all of our attendees, and thank you, Ian, for providing your presentation and answering anybody's questions. Would you mind just noting how people can get in touch with you if they'd like some further information on anything?
Yeah, I think I've got Ian at watsonord.com is my email. And if you want to drop me anything about that, I'm always happy to talk about health and safety. Mike will tell you about that. It's a passion of mine. And I know Mike's kind of doing a talk next week after next. And I think, yeah, we like talking about health and safety. For me, it's not an embarrassing subject. It's an important subject. And it's just that we don't really sell health and safety very well to people. And I think that's the importance of this behavioral approach, the simple behavioral approach of talking to people. And if we do that, we usually come up with the right decisions and the right actions. So yeah, if you've got my email, kind of drop me a line, kind of not a problem at all.
So my colleague Sophie has just dropped the website and email address in the chat, so that's there if anybody needs it. As we mentioned at the beginning, this session's been recorded, so in a few days' time, next week at the latest, we should have this uploaded along with all the details if you want to reach out to Ian there. Don't forget, you can head over to our website, selkie-project.eu, and if you look at under the events tab, you'll see all of the other sessions that are coming up in the future. Don't forget, you can follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter as well. Just look up Selkie Project and the Selkie Network. But yeah, thanks again to everybody who joined, and have a good day.
Brilliant. Stay safe.